In the summer heat of 1831, deep in the plantations of Southampton County, Virginia, a man walked silently through the rows of cotton, his eyes calm but his mind burning with visions that would reshape American history. His name was Nat Turner, a slave born into chains yet destined to become one of the most feared and controversial figures the nation would ever know. To many enslavers he was a dangerous rebel possessed by madness. To the enslaved he was a symbol of hope, proof that even the most brutal systems could be challenged from within. And to history, he became a story so unsettling, so powerful, that America spent generations trying to bury it. This is not the version taught in school textbooks or softened by polite society. This is the raw story, the visions, the uprising, the terror, the courage, the consequences. The story of how an enslaved preacher denied humanity but not purpose, dared to defy an empire built on suffering. The story of Nat Turner, and why his name still shakes America even after nearly 2 centuries. Nat Turner's childhood was unlike that of most enslaved children, not because it was free of suffering, but because it was marked by signs that made the adults around him whisper, stare, and wonder. Born into bondage on October 2, 1800, he entered a world already designed to crush his potential, yet from the beginning he carried an unusual presence that even his enslavers noticed. Stories circulated that as an infant he could remember things far beyond his age, that he spoke with an awareness children were not supposed to have, that he absorbed details about people and places as if his mind were always awake. Enslaved elders believed he had been touched by ancestors, that some spirit of old Africa lived within him, guiding him, watching over him. In a society where the enslaved fought daily to maintain their identity against relentless assaults, such gifts were cherished but also feared because anything special about a slave could attract the wrong attention from those in power. Turner grew up surrounded by voices telling him he had a purpose, even though no one knew what shape that purpose would take, and he himself could not yet understand what it meant. From the earliest days of his memory he claimed to experience vivid dreams filled with symbols no child could explain. He saw forms in the sky, shapes that twisted into messages he couldn't decipher but felt deeply in his bone. He would describe these visions to his mother, who listened but feared what they meant for a son trapped in a world where enslavers controlled every breath of their lives. She warned him to be careful with his words, to keep what he saw inside his mind, because even the suggestion of spiritual insight in an enslaved person could lead to harsh punishment or worse. His grandmother, a woman believed to have been born free in Africa before being captured, offered a different perspective. She reinforced his sense of uniqueness, telling him stories of prophets and warriors, of people guided by spirits across oceans, of ancestors who spoke through dreams. For Nat, these stories became a mental refuge but also a map of identity, something to hold on to as he grew into a world that constantly tried to erase who he was. As a child he observed everything around him with an intensity that made others take notice. He watched his enslavers, listened to their conversations, read their expressions, memorized their routines. He studied the fields, the animals, the changing of the seasons, as though every detail contained a lesson. Most enslaved children were forbidden from learning to read or write, but Turner found ways to absorb knowledge anyway. He studied the Bible when he could, often in secret, fascinated less by the stories of deliverance, and more by the idea that divine purpose could rest on ordinary people in extraordinary ways. The enslavers noticed his intelligence too, but instead of nurturing it, they viewed it with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. An intelligent slave was useful, but also dangerous. Nat's brilliance wasn't loud or boastful. It was the quiet, observant kind that made people uneasy because they never knew what he was thinking. His visions intensified as he grew older. He described moments when the world around him seemed to shift, lights appearing in the sky, voices whispering inside his mind, colors swirling in the air. To Turner, these were not hallucinations or the imagination of a child. They were messages, instructions sent from a force beyond the plantation fences. Sometimes he saw images of battles, sometimes of walking figures covered in light, sometimes of blood falling like rain. These visions frightened him, yet they also gave him a sense of direction, as though a path was being revealed piece by piece. The enslaved community around him held deeply spiritual beliefs, inherited from African traditions blended with Christianity, so they listened to his descriptions with a mixture of reverence and concern. They worried for him because children who saw too much often became adults who suffered too much, yet they also believed that visions came for a reason. By adolescence, Nat Turner was already known among enslaved people as someone different, someone who carried an energy that couldn't be explained. Elders sought him out, not for entertainment but for insight. Younger children followed him, drawn by his calmness. Even some enslavers acknowledged that he possessed what they called a strange mind, a phrase that revealed their inability to understand. Turner himself struggled with the burden of these visions, especially since he had no one who could fully interpret them. He wanted answers, but the world around him provided only fragments. Still, he felt that everything he saw was leading him towards something monumental. There were moments when Turner tried to reject the weight placed upon him. He attempted to live like other enslaved boys, participating in work routines, tending to chores, following orders, blending into the daily rhythm of plantation life. He laughed with friends, learned to navigate the harshness of overseers, and endured the constant exhaustion of forced labor. Yet the visions never left him. Sometimes they appeared in the middle of the night, jolting him awake. Other times they appeared while he worked under the sun, making the world blur around him until all he could see was light and motion. These moments frightened others who witnessed them, but what frightened Turner more was the feeling that he was being prepared for something he couldn't yet understand. What made his childhood particularly remarkable was not simply the presence of visions but how they shaped his thinking. He began to interpret the suffering he saw around him, the beatings, the separations of families, the endless labor, as part of a larger spiritual battle. While most enslaved children learned to suppress their emotions and accept survival as the only goal, Nat developed a sense of destiny fueled by the belief that he had been chosen for a purpose. This was not arrogance. It was the only way he could make sense of the messages that had shadowed him since infancy. His mind became a battleground of fear, faith, and anticipation, all tied to the idea that the world he knew was temporary, that change was coming, and that he would play a role in it. Even in moments of silence, Turner felt watched, not by overseers or enslavers but by something unseen. The enslaved around him began to treat him with a mixture of respect and caution, as though he carried a fire that could burn anyone who came too close. Turner carried these expectations with both pride and fear. He didn't fully understand the weight of what people believed about him, but he could feel it pressing on him, shaping him. He sensed that his childhood was not merely a phase of life but a preparation, that every vision, every whisper, every symbol he encountered was part of a puzzle designed to reveal a truth he was destined to act upon. The brutal realities of slavery that shaped Nat Turner's awakening began long before he had words to describe them, long before he understood the difference between freedom and bondage. From childhood, he watched the world around him with eyes that saw everything, and what he saw carved itself into his mind with a sharpness that never faded. The plantation was not merely a place of labor, it was a machine of suffering, built on domination, silence and fear. Every sunrise meant another day of labor, every sunset meant another night of uncertainty. Nat witnessed the way overseers monitored every movement, how enslaved people bent their backs under the weight of work that was never done, and how even the simplest act, resting for a moment, speaking too loudly, showing defiance, could bring punishment. These everyday realities formed the environment that shaped his understanding of the world, an understanding built on the knowledge that suffering was not accidental, but intentional, engineered to break the spirit as much as the body. One of the earliest lessons he learned was that enslaved people were treated not as human beings but as property. He heard enslavers discuss them in cold, detached tones, as if they were tools, livestock or machines. Children saw their parents sold away, husbands saw their wives beaten, and mothers watched their infants torn from their arms and auctioned off. These scenes happened not in isolated instances, but as part of the routine cruelty of plantation life. Nat remembered the sound of chains dragging across the ground, the muffled sobs of families torn apart, and the tight, trembling silence that fell over the quarters after each sale. Such moments were not only traumatic, they shaped the emotional landscape of every enslaved person, a landscape filled with grief that had no outlet and anger that had no safe place to go. Physical punishment was a constant threat, used to enforce submission and obedience. Nat saw men whipped until their backs were torn open, women struck for hesitating under the weight of heavy loads, and children forced to watch as their parents suffered. The overseers used brutal tools, whips braided with metal tips, wooden paddles, iron collars with spikes to ensure that resistance never took root. Turner couldn't forget the cries that echoed across the fields, the way the air itself seemed to tighten each time a punishment began, or the sickening silence that followed when the body finally gave out. These moments filled him with a deep, simmering rage he could not fully voice, but they also planted in him a profound sense of moral clarity. He understood early on that the system was not merely oppressive, it was evil, a deliberate violation of everything human. Nat also witnessed slavery's psychological warfare. Enslavers often used humiliation as a weapon, targeting pride, dignity and identity. They changed names, forbade cultural traditions, and punished the use of African languages. They mocked the enslaved for praying too loudly, for crying after a whipping, even for showing intelligence. For someone like Turner, whose mind was always active, this psychological violence was especially painful. He heard enslavers say that slaves were meant to be ignorant, that education would make them rebellious, that thinking was a privilege reserved for white men. These ideas enraged him. because even as a boy he knew that the enslavers feared the intelligence of the enslaved precisely because it revealed the lies slavery depended on. The more Nat observed these tactics, the more he realized that slavery sought, not only to control the body, but also to crush the spirit, to rewrite the mind until obedience felt like the only possible choice. Faith played a complex role in this reality. On the plantation, enslavers used religion both as a tool and a weapon. They preached selective Bible passages that emphasized obedience, submission, and the idea that suffering was God's will for slaves. Nat sat through these sermons with a burning resentment, recognizing the manipulation embedded in every word. Yet in the quarters at night, a different kind of worship took place, one filled with whispered prayers, secret songs, and the faint heartbeat of hope. This duality shaped his awakening profoundly. He understood the enslaver's version of Christianity as a distortion, a twisted tool of control, while he saw the spiritual practices of the enslaved as a quiet rebellion, a way of preserving humanity in the face of daily brutality. The contrast made him think deeply about justice, morality and divine purpose, pushing him to question who truly spoke for God and whose message was built on lies. Labor itself was another defining force in his awakening. He watched how enslaved men and women worked from before sunrise to after sunset, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion. Children were not spared. From a young age they carried water, ran messages or helped in field. Nat himself was put to work early, and through this grueling routine he learned the rhythms of plantation life. He saw how little his effort mattered. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how quickly he completed tasks, he remained a slave. The realization that labor could never earn him freedom etched itself into his identity. He understood that his value to the system was tied entirely to how much his body could produce, and this understanding deepened his resentment and sharpened his awareness of the injustice he lived under. One of the most devastating realities he observed was the destruction of family structure. Enslaved families lived with constant uncertainty, never knowing when an enslaver might decide to sell a parent, child or spouse. Nat heard the stories of fathers who were sold without warning, mothers who were forced into breeding arrangements, children who disappeared overnight. This instability created a deep emotional wound in the enslaved community, one that shaped Turner's developing sense of responsibility. He saw the suffering of those around him, the heartbreak of families torn apart, and he began to feel that their pain was part of the burden he would one day carry. Even as a child, he was moved not only by his own suffering, but by the collective suffering of the enslaved, a suffering so vast that it seemed impossible for the world to continue without some kind of reckoning. He also witnessed acts of resistance, though small and often hidden. Enslaved people sabotaged tools, feigned illness, slowed their pace of work, and passed along coded messages. They formed bonds of solidarity, shared food in secret, and protected each other from overseers when possible. These quiet acts of defiance showed Nat that the enslaved were not broken people resigned to their fate. They were survivors, fighters, individuals who resisted in whatever ways they could. These moments of resistance ignited something inside him, showing him that rebellion was not a fantasy but a living possibility, growing in the shadows of every plantation. The more he saw these acts, the more he felt that one day resistance would need to rise beyond small gestures, and take a greater, more decisive form. Turner's awakening was further shaped by moments when he saw enslavers behave with casual cruelty, as if suffering were a form of entertainment. He remembered holidays where enslaved people were forced to dance for the amusement of whites, auctions where human beings were displayed like livestock, and drunken celebrations where violence erupted without warning. These scenes taught Nat that the enslaver's cruelty was not merely a byproduct of the system, but an integral part of it, supported socially, legally and economically. This understanding hardened his view of slavery, pushing him toward a conclusion that would shape his future, that the system was not reformable, not negotiable, not something that could be softened. It was a structure that demanded violence to sustain itself, and therefore could only be dismantled through violence. Over time, all these experiences combined to form within Nat Turner a powerful internal storm, a mix of rage, grief, clarity and purpose. He began to see the world not just as a place of personal suffering, but as a battlefield between truth and brutality, justice and oppression, divinity and corruption. The brutality around him didn't numb him, it awakened, it sharpened his mind, hardened his convictions, and deepened his belief that he had been chosen not to endure this world silently, but to challenge it. Nat Turner's rise as a secret preacher among enslaved communities did not begin with a formal appointment or a grand declaration. It started quietly, almost invisibly, shaped by the way people listened to him, the way his presence settled into a room, and the way his words seemed to carry weight even before he fully understood their power. His visions and spiritual sensitivity made many enslaved people see him as someone chosen,
someone touched by something beyond the physical world. On plantations where suffering was constant and hope was scarce, a man who spoke with conviction, who interpreted scripture with clarity, and who seemed connected to a higher purpose became a beacon. Nat did not ask for followers, they gathered around him naturally, drawn by the depth of his insight and the calm authority in his voice. He began studying the Bible intensely, not as a text of submission the enslavers often preached, but as a book of liberation. He read about Moses leading his people out of bondage, about prophets who rose against corrupt rulers, about divine justice falling upon oppressors. These stories resonated deeply with him, not as distant legends but as blueprints of resistance. Nat saw the Bible as a living document, something that spoke directly to the suffering of the enslaved. His interpretations were radical, not because they twisted scripture, but because they returned it to its core themes of justice, righteousness and deliverance. As he shared these interpretations with others, enslaved people began to feel a sense of empowerment, a belief that their pain was not invisible to God, and that their liberation was not a far-off fantasy but a possibility waiting to be claimed. What made Turner's preaching especially powerful was the secrecy surrounding it. Enslavers allowed certain religious activities because they believed religion could pacify enslaved people, but they never intended for those gatherings to spark resistance. Nat understood the dangers of preaching openly, so he delivered his messages in whispered circles, in dimly lit cabins. In the quiet hours after the fields had emptied, people would slip away from their quarters and gather in small groups, speaking softly, listening carefully, always aware that a single wrong word overheard by the wrong person could lead to torture or death. The secrecy added a weight to his message, turning every word into something sacred, something risky, something worth hearing despite the danger. Turner's sermons were unlike the sermons delivered by white preachers hired to control enslaved minds. Those preachers spoke about obedience, duty and acceptance of earthly suffering. Nat, however, spoke of divine dissatisfaction with injustice, of God's anger burning hotter than the overseer's whip, of a coming reckoning in which the oppressed would rise and the oppressors would fall. His words did not merely comfort, they ignited, they awakened memories of African resistance traditions, where spiritual leaders often doubled as warriors and revolutionaries. For many enslaved Africans and African Americans, spirituality and resistance were intertwined, and Turner's preaching resurrected that connection in a powerful way. His influence spread quietly but steadily, moving from one plantation to another through trusted networks. A woman on one plantation might whisper about the preacher who saw visions. A man on a neighboring estate might pass along a verse Nat had interpreted in a way that felt revolutionary. Songs emerged with double meanings, lyrics that sounded like praise on the surface but carried coded messages about freedom beneath. Nat's role was never just as a preacher. He became a symbol of collective yearning, a focal point for the simmering anger that had been building in enslaved communities for generations. What made his presence so compelling was not simply his ability to speak but the way he lived. Nat Turner walked with a quiet conviction. He worked hard, followed instructions when necessary, and rarely displayed open defiance, which made him less suspicious in the eyes of overseers. But among the enslaved he was viewed with a different lens. People noticed the calm intensity in his gaze, the moments when he seemed lost in thought as if receiving some divine message, the way he paused before speaking as though choosing words delivered to him from somewhere beyond the physical world. His demeanor added to the mystique around him. He seemed less like an ordinary man, and more like a vessel for something greater. Turner's reputation grew further when he began to share his visions again, not as childhood wonders, but as divine messages with clear meaning. He described seeing lights in the sky, figures in the clouds, signs in nature that spoke of change. The enslaved people around him did not dismiss these visions as madness. Many believed in spiritual signs, in dreams that carried meaning, in ancestors communicating through symbol. Nat's visions aligned with their cultural memory, their inherited ways of understanding the world. To them, his sightings were proof that God had chosen a messenger among them, someone who could see beyond the suffering of the present into the possibility of liberation. The white enslavers, however, remained largely unaware of this growing spiritual move. They underestimated the intellectual and spiritual depth of the enslaved, believing them incapable of organizing, strategizing, or interpreting scripture independently. This blindness became an advantage for Turner. While the enslavers believed religion kept slaves compliant, Nat was using religion to build a quiet network of people spiritually prepared for change. His sermons reached across plantation boundaries, connecting individuals who rarely had the chance to speak but shared a common pain and a common hope. Turner never needed to shout his message or gather large crowds. His influence worked like a quiet river cutting through rocks, slow, steady, unstoppable. People trusted him because he carried himself like a man who knew his purpose. He never exploited their reverence. Instead, he shouldered it with the seriousness of someone who knew that leadership under such circumstances was not about glory but about sacrifice. He preached not to elevate himself but to elevate the consciousness of those around him, to remind them that they were not created to live and die in bondage, that their suffering was not divinely ordained, but the product of human cruelty. His role as a secret preacher also exposed him to the inner emotional world of the enslaved community. He heard their stories, their grief, their fears, their shattered hopes. He saw the tears people tried to hide, the moments of quiet despair after yet another beating, another auction, another humiliation. These confessions deepened his empathy but also sharpened his resolve. Each story became another reason why the system needed to be confronted, why silence was no longer bearable, why the visions he received felt increasingly like instructions instead of signs. As he comforted the enslaved with spiritual words, he internalized their suffering, carrying it with him like a weight pressing against his ribs. Over time, Nat Turner's preaching evolved from mere interpretation of scripture to a call for spiritual readiness. He spoke about waiting for divine signs, about preparing the soul for change, about recognizing when God's hand moved in the world. He never openly spoke of rebellion at that stage, but his words planted seeds that grew quietly in the hearts of those who heard him. His message was a slow ignition, a smoldering fire beneath the surface of plantation life. People felt something shifting, not just in Nat but in the world around. The sky seemed to hold more meaning, the seasons seemed to whisper warnings, and every sermon felt like another step towards something inevitable. By the time Nat Turner became widely respected as a spiritual leader among the enslaved, he was no longer just a preacher. He had become the pulse of a hidden movement, a guiding force in a world where open resistance meant death, but silent preparation meant survival. His influence reached minds and hearts in ways invisible to the enslavers but undeniable to those who gathered in secrecy to hear him speak. Through whispers, visions, scripture and quiet conviction, Nat Turner became the spiritual architect of a collective awakening, an awakening that would soon transform into something far more explosive, far more dangerous, and far more unforgettable.
Nat Turner's spiritual revelations did not arrive as gentle whispers or quiet moments of reflection. They came with force, intensity, and urgency, shaping his inner world with a clarity that was impossible for him to ignore. From the beginning, his visions had been mysterious, filled with symbols he struggled to understand. But as he grew older, they began to take on a sharper meaning. What had once been confusing flashes now formed coherent messages, patterns he could interpret, signals that pointed not to personal enlightenment but to a divine mission. These revelations were not something he sought out. They pursued him, interrupting his sleep, overtaking his thoughts, appearing in moments when he least expected them. Turner felt as though an invisible hand was turning his attention toward a reality beyond the visible, a realm where spiritual truths guided the actions of men. The more he prayed, the stronger the visions grew. He described moments when the sky itself seemed to speak, when the movement of the wind felt like a divine gesture, when the rustling of leaves carried meanings too profound to dismiss. Nat interpreted these phenomena through the lens of scripture, which he studied with a depth unmatched by most enslaved people, and certainly far beyond what enslavers intended. To him, every verse was alive, every story a reflection of his world. When he read about prophets chosen to lead their people, about divine wrath against injustice, about angels delivering messages of liberation, he did not see these as distant historical accounts. He saw them as reflections of his own life, his own purpose. The boundary between biblical prophecy and his own spiritual experiences began to blur, to merge, until he felt certain that the God of the Bible was the same God speaking to him directly. One of the pivotal revelations he experienced involved a shimmering light in the sky, a vision so vivid that he later described it with absolute conviction. He saw shapes forming in the heavens, patterns that resembled hieroglyphs or ancient symbols, though he had no knowledge of such writing. These symbols seemed to pulse with meaning, glowing and fading, drawing his gaze upward as though they were messages written across the firmament. As he stared, he felt a powerful sense of recognition, not because he understood the symbols intellectually, but because they resonated with something deep within him. It felt as though the message was meant specifically for him, as if God had chosen that very moment to send a directive that would guide the next phase of his life. Turner also experienced visions involving battles, scenes of dramatic confrontation between forces of light and darkness. These were not simple metaphors. He saw them with the clarity of someone recalling memories rather than imagining possibilities. He described soldiers marching across a field bathed in strange light, their faces determined, their weapons raised. He saw a great force descending from the heavens, scattering the armies of oppression. He saw rivers tinted red, which he interpreted not as signs of destruction but as symbols of purification and justice. Each of these visions reinforced his belief that conflict, not passive endurance, was at the heart of God's plan for delivering the oppressed. In Turner's mind, these revelations were not warnings of danger, but affirmations that the struggle ahead was not only inevitable but divinely sanctioned. Another revelation that deeply affected him was the sound of a voice calling his name. It did not come from any person around him. It resonated within him, echoing in a way that made it impossible to dismiss as imagination. The voice spoke with authority, giving him instructions he could not ignore. Though he never claimed to understand the full meaning of every message, he always insisted that the voice was real and that it belonged to a higher power guiding him toward a purpose he had yet to fulfill. For Turner, this wasn't the kind of experience one doubts or questions. It was an undeniable truth that shaped every decision he made afterward. As these revelations intensified, Turner became increasingly convinced that he had been chosen for a mission. This belief did not emerge from ego or ambition. It stemmed from the overwhelming weight of spiritual responsibility he felt pressing upon him. He saw the suffering of the enslaved as part of a cosmic imbalance that demanded rectification. Every beating he heard, every child torn from their mother's arms, every humiliation inflicted upon his people, only strengthened his conviction that God was preparing him to take action. Turner understood his visions as warnings that the time of waiting was nearing its end, and the time for action was approaching. He believed that God had preserved him through childhood, guided him through youth, and shaped his mind through struggle so that he would be ready when the moment came. One of the most profound revelations occurred when he interpreted a solar eclipse as a divine sign. The sudden darkening of the sky felt to him like a supernatural event, a signal that God was intervening directly in the world of men. To many enslaved people, natural phenomena carried deep spiritual significance, and Turner was no exception. He stood beneath the darkened sun and felt a surge of certainty. This was not an ordinary eclipse, but a message telling him that his mission was drawing near. Turner saw the eclipse as confirmation that the world was shifting, that divine forces were aligning, and that he was meant to play a central role in the transformation that was beginning to unfold. Turner's revelations also led him to examine signs in everyday life. He saw meaning in numbers, in patterns, in the behavior of animals, in the arrangement of clouds. The world became a tapestry woven with divine threads, each one pointing him toward an impending moment of upheaval. Dreams played a major role as well. In some dreams he saw himself standing atop a mountain, surrounded by people looking to him for guidance. In others he witnessed scenes of devastation, followed by renewal and peace. These dreams were not abstract reflections. They felt like premonitions, glimpses of a future that God had chosen him to initiate. Turner spoke of these dreams to trusted followers, sharing enough to inspire faith, but keeping the most intense details hidden, fearing that speaking too openly could expose them to danger before the appointed time. As his revelations became more frequent, Turner found it difficult to participate in the daily routines of plantation life without feeling the weight of his calling. Every task, every order, every moment of labor reminded him of the system he was destined to confront. He felt as though God had placed him at the center of a divine plan, not because he was stronger or smarter than others, but because he had been given the eyes to see what others could not. This belief transformed him from a preacher offering comfort into a prophet receiving instructions. The spiritual burden he carried grew heavier, but it also filled him with resolve. He felt no fear in the face of what God demanded. Instead he felt clarity, certainty, and purpose. These revelations shaped not only his beliefs but his identity. Nat Turner no longer saw himself merely as an enslaved man. He saw himself as a chosen instrument of divine justice. He carried this identity quietly but confidently, knowing that the time to act would come when the signs aligned. His followers sensed this transformation. They saw it in his eyes, in the way he paused before speaking, in the way he walked through the quarters with an air of certainty that could not be explained by ordinary means. Turner had moved beyond preaching. He had stepped into the role of a prophet whose visions pointed toward a future where the oppressed would rise, the oppressors would fall, and justice would be restored by divine will. He became a symbol of defiance, not through loud rebellion or open confrontation but through the quiet, unshakable strength that seemed to radiate from him even in the worst moments. People whispered his name across plantations, not because he fought with weapons in his hands, but because he fought with a spirit that refused to be broken. There was something in the way he stood, in the way he looked his oppressors directly in the eye, in the way he carried himself like a man who remembered he came from ancestors who were kings long before anyone tried to call him property. That presence alone made overseers uneasy, and made other enslaved people feel something they hadn't felt in years: hope. Even those who never spoke to him directly watched him closely, studying how he moved through the world with an inner fire no amount of cruelty could extinguish. The stories about him traveled fast, carried in hushed conversations late at night in cramped slave quarters, told by elders who had seen many souls crushed by the weight of bondage. They said he walked differently, that his steps were steady even when his body carried scars from punishments meant to break him.
They said he had a way of speaking so calmly that even the worst orders from the slave drivers seemed to lose their power the moment he lifted his head and answered with a tone that told them he would obey the command, but never the owner. Enslaved men and women watching from the fields said they could feel something shift when he passed by, like the air thickened with the silent message that dignity was not something anyone could steal, not even with chains, whips or laws written to strip humans of their identity. People said he had an ability to make others believe that their lives still mattered, that their stories still counted, that their suffering wasn't the final chapter. He didn't preach or lecture, he simply lived in a way that reminded them they weren't powerless, no matter how cruel the world became. On days when the sun burned overhead and backs bent under endless labor, his presence pulled others through their exhaustion. When children cried from hunger and mothers struggled to comfort them, the elders pointed toward him and whispered that as long as he still stood tall, there was still a reason to endure. Strength, like that, couldn't be taught. It was carried in the bones, in the memories of a homeland stolen but not forgotten. Even the slave masters took notice. They watched him with suspicion, unable to understand how someone treated with such brutality could continue to walk with the pride of a free man. They assigned overseers to monitor him closely, fearing that someone with that much charisma and quiet influence could spark something they couldn't control. But no matter how much surveillance they placed on him, he never gave them a reason to punish him for rebellion. He did his work, obeyed the rules outwardly, and yet carried an energy that made them uneasy. It was as if he followed orders with his hands, but followed a different set of laws in his heart. That contradiction, obedient but unbroken, was what made him so dangerous to the system built on crushing spirits before they could inspire others. Those who worked beside him learned more from his silence than from his words. They noticed how he never rushed through his tasks, never slouched his shoulders in defeat, never allowed anger to consume him even on days when cruelty was at its worst. Instead, he endured every hardship with a steadiness that made others wonder what kind of strength he carried inside him. Some said he prayed to the ancestors under his breath. Some said he was guided by visions of freedom. Some believed he had been chosen by something greater than all of them to carry the weight of their hope. Whatever the truth was, everyone around him felt the same thing. He reminded them that they were more than what the world reduced them to. At night, when the fields finally fell silent and the stars emerged overhead, people gathered around him whenever he spoke. His voice wasn't loud or commanding. It was low, steady, filled with a kind of wisdom born from pain and perseverance. He talked about home, not the plantation but the land across the ocean that their ancestors once walked. He described traditions passed down in fragments, stories pieced together from memory, myths, and whispers carried from one generation to the next. When he talked, people closed their eyes and imagined a place without chains, a place where their spirits were whole. Those moments became a lifeline for many, a way to survive days that otherwise felt unbearable. Some nights he said nothing at all, yet people still gathered around him, drawn to the calm strength he carried like a shield. They felt safer near him, as if his presence alone created a small pocket of peace in a world built on violence. He didn't need to speak to comfort them. He simply existed in a way that reminded them they weren't alone. Even the children sensed it. They followed him around with wide eyes, mimicking his movements, trying to imitate the quiet bravery they saw in him. To them he was more than a man. He was a story they wanted to remember, a living lesson that strength didn't come only from fists or rebellion, but from refusing to let the world define them. There were moments when his influence became undeniable, moments when people stood a little taller in the fields just because he was nearby, moments when someone who had been beaten the day before found enough courage to keep going because they saw him walk past with his chin raised. He wasn't free, but he made freedom feel closer, like something that might be possible, even if only in the heart for now. The overseers noticed these changes too. They saw how the others watched him, how they mirrored his posture, how the atmosphere shifted when he was present. The plantation depended on breaking people apart, making them feel isolated, powerless, alone. But he quietly unraveled that structure just by existing as someone who believed in more. The more the stories spread, the more he became a symbol beyond his own life. People on nearby plantations heard rumors about a man who couldn't be broken, a man whose spirit remained unshaken no matter the punishment. Even those who had never seen his face spoke his name with a mix of admiration and longing, hoping to borrow some of his strength through the telling of his story. His legacy grew long before he ever escaped or resisted openly. It grew from the countless small moments when he chose dignity over despair, when he chose hope over hopelessness, when he chose to carry the weight of everyone's faith in something better without ever asking for recognition. He never asked to become a symbol, but symbols are born from necessity, and in a world built on suffering, his strength became the light people clung to because he reminded them that even in chains, a spirit could remain unshackled. There was a moment when his life shifted in a way that even he didn't fully understand, A moment when the weight of everything he had endured crystallized into a single realization that would shape his actions moving forward. It didn't come during a beating, or in the middle of a long day in the fields, or in the quiet hours of the night when the world finally fell still. It came unexpectedly, during one of those ordinary days when the sky hung low and gray, and the air felt thick with the kind of heaviness that made it hard to breathe. He had been bent over a row of crops like always, feeling the ache in his back, the sting of old scars pulling against his skin, and the dull numbness that came from a life spent under the eyes of men who saw him as something less than human. But in that moment something inside him shifted, like a lock clicking open after years of waiting. He realized that the pain he had been forced to carry since the day he was taken wasn't just a burden, it was a kind of knowledge. Every lash, every insult, every moment of humiliation had taught him something about the world and about himself. He understood now that the suffering he endured wasn't simply cruelty, it was a strategy, a method used to strip people of their sense of identity until they forgot who they were. But he hadn't forgotten, even when they tried to erase his name, his memories, his connections to the past. A piece of him had held on, stubborn and unyielding. That was the moment he recognized the power of remembering, the power of refusing to let his story be rewritten by those who wanted him to be nothing more than a tool. He saw clearly that as long as he remembered who he was, they could never fully own him. This realization didn't make him fearless, but it made him deliberate. Every step he took from that day carried a different kind of weight, a quiet determination that came from understanding that he had something worth protecting. It wasn't just his own life, it was the memory of the people who came before him, the ones who had lived and laughed and fought long before he was dragged into this world of chains and command. He began to move through the plantation with a sharpened sense of awareness, noticing patterns he had never paid attention to before, the way the overseers changed shifts, the gaps in the patrols, the weak points in the fences, the habits of the dogs that guarded the perimeter. He understood that knowledge could become a weapon even if he never physically held one. He didn't speak of his awakening to anyone, not even to the few he trusted. Silence was its own kind of protection. Years of surviving under oppression had taught him that words could be dangerous, that even a hint of rebellion spoken out loud could cost someone their life. So he kept his thoughts hidden behind a mask of obedience, allowing the world to think of him as just another laborer beaten into submission. But inside him something was building layer by layer, like a fortress constructed from memories, pain and the refusal to surrender. Every small act of kindness he witnessed, every whisper of a story passed secretly between enslaved people, every moment of defiance he observed, added another stone to that inner structure. He started paying attention to the newcomers, the ones recently brought to the plantation who still carried the shock of captivity in their eyes. He watched the way they looked around, trying to understand the new world they had been thrown into, trying to make sense of rules designed to crush their spirit. He understood them more than they knew, so he stepped in quietly when he could, offering a steadying hand, a reassuring presence, a sense of continuity in a place where everything felt foreign and hostile. He didn't speak words of comfort, he didn't promise things he couldn't give. Instead he showed them through his actions that survival wasn't just possible, it was something they could master if they learned to adapt without losing themselves. The more he observed, the more he understood how deeply the structure of control relied on division. People were kept separate not just physically but emotionally and mentally. Distrust was planted like seeds in the soil. Punishments were carried out publicly, not just to hurt one person but to frighten everyone else. The smallest flicker of unity was stamped out before it had the chance to grow. Realizing this, he became more intentional about the way he interacted with others. He learned to read their emotions in their posture, their tone, their silence. He recognized fear disguised as anger, despair masked as indifference, hope hidden in glances shared during moments when the overseers weren't watching. These small human signals became his language, a way to communicate without speaking, a way to build connections that couldn't be easily broken. He found himself thinking about freedom differently. It was no longer a distant dream shaped by stories of runaways in far-off lands, where slavery had no power. It became something internal, something he could cultivate even within the boundaries of the plantation. Every time he remembered his past, every time he helped someone endure another day without losing their sense of self, every time he refused to let the cruelty consume him, he felt a piece of freedom grow stronger within him. He understood that physical escape might not be possible yet, but mental liberation was something they couldn't take away unless he let them. As the seasons changed, so did he. The man who once moved through life in a state of resigned endurance, now walked with purpose. His thoughts were clearer, sharper, rooted in a sense of identity that the overseers had failed to destroy. He began to think about the future in ways he never had before, not with hopeless longing but with quiet strategy. He knew that opportunities were rare and dangerous, but he also knew that one day the right moment would come, and when it did he needed to be ready. That meant training his mind to stay alert, training his emotions to stay controlled, and training his spirit to stay resilient. He noticed that others were changing too, influenced not by his words but by the energy he carried. People who once avoided eye contact now held his gaze for a second longer. Those who had given up hope began to show small signs of resistance. A straighter back, a slower step when ordered to hurry, a moment of hesitation before lowering their head. These were not acts of rebellion the overseers would notice, but he noticed. He saw the beginnings of something stirring beneath the surface, something fragile but powerful. Through all of this he continued to live as though nothing had changed. That was the key to survival, moving quietly, thinking deeply, acting only when necessary. He cultivated patience because he understood that haste was the enemy of freedom. He allowed the world to underestimate him because that invisibility was a shield. He carried his awakening like a hidden flame, protecting it from the winds of cruelty that blew through his life daily. And though no one else knew the full extent of what he felt, they could sense something in him, something that made them believe that he was no longer just another man in chains, but someone who had begun to see the path ahead with new clarity.
The night the uprising began did not announce itself with thunder or sudden chaos. It unfolded quietly like a breath held too long finally being released. The air was thick with the humidity of late August, heavy enough that every sound felt muffled as if the world itself were holding its voice back. Somewhere beyond the tree line the moon hid behind a thin veil of clouds, casting just enough light to blur the edges of the fields without revealing the full outline of the land. It was a night that looked like countless others, and that was precisely what made it the right moment. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing felt out of place, and the routine stillness of the Plateauans became the perfect cover for what was about to begin. He moved through the shadows with a calmness that masked the intensity of what he was carrying within him. Every step felt like it was guided by something greater than fear or resolve, something that had been building for years. Around him the others gathered in small clusters, appearing as if they were merely slipping away to rest or finish their chores. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence had a weight to it, a shared understanding that words might shatter the fragile balance that was holding their courage in place. They exchanged glances that carried entire histories of suffering, of faith, of the unbreakable desire for something beyond the life they had been forced into. In the dim light he could barely make out the faces of the men who had chosen to stand with him. Some were older, worn by decades of labor, their bodies marked by scars that told stories no one ever asked to hear. Others were younger, their strength still fresh, but their eyes already hardened by the harsh realities they'd witnessed. Each carried something different into that moment: grief, anger, exhaustion, hope, but all of it came together in a single purpose. They had waited for signs, waited for certainty, waited for the moment that felt right, and now that it had arrived, their breathing fell into a kind of unspoken rhythm. The atmosphere around them felt suspended, as if time itself had paused to watch what these men were about to do. In the distance the faint glow of lanterns illuminated the houses where the slaveholders slept, unaware of the storm gathering at their doorstep. The sound of crickets filled the silence, the only reminder that nature continued its cycle even as human history prepared to shift. The men stood close enough to feel each other's presence, but far enough that they would not draw attention if anyone happened to look out a window. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, shaped by the understanding that one wrong gesture could unravel everything. He felt the weight of the moment settle across his shoulders like a cloak. It wasn't the kind of burden that came from responsibility alone. It was deeper, heavier, tied to the generations that had lived and died under bondage before him. He carried their memories, their pain, their unheard prayers for deliverance. He felt their presence like a force pressing against his spine, urging him forward. He knew that what they were about to do would echo in ways none of them could fully imagine. It wasn't simply an act of violence. It was a declaration that their humanity could no longer be ignored, a declaration that they were willing to risk everything rather than continue living in chains. The moment the first signal was given, the stillness of the night cracked. It was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, almost gentle, like the shift between one heartbeat and the next. The men moved with a precision born from months of quiet preparation. They texted the house slowly, their footsteps blending into the soil. Each one knew his role, knew the dangers, knew that once they crossed a certain threshold, there would be no return to the life they had known. The boundary between slavery and freedom was suddenly right in front of them, not a physical barrier, but a spiritual one, a line drawn between who they had been and who they were about to become. Inside the house the lanterns flickered softly, casting shadows along the wall. The sounds of sleeping bodies drifted through the still air, oblivious to the approaching danger. The men took their positions, their breathing slow and controlled, their hands steady despite the enormity of what they were about to do. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, holding them in a tense suspension as if the world were waiting to see who would act first. Then, in a single movement that broke the silence like glass, the uprising began. It wasn't chaos at first. It was precise, focused, driven by a cold clarity that came from understanding that survival depended on eliminating the sources of power before the alarm could be raised. The men moved like a single organism, each person's fear and resolve intertwined with the next. Their actions were swift, but their minds remained sharp, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every shift in the shadows, every breath taken in the dark. They were acutely aware that any small mistake could turn the tide against them before they had a chance to spread the revolt to the neighboring plantations. Once the first household fell silent, the men moved on quickly, knowing they had only minutes before someone discovered what had happened. They slipped through the night like phantoms traveling through woods and across fields, guided not by roads but by instinct and memory. With each new step the uprising grew, fueled by the desperation and courage that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. They knew that their actions would be met with overwhelming force once the slaveholders realized what was happening, but that didn't slow their steps. Instead, it pushed them forward, propelled by the belief that this night represented their one chance to rewrite the destiny forced upon them. As they pressed from one plantation to the next, the darkness seemed to shift around them. The air felt electric, charged with a mixture of horror, hope, uncertainty, and determination. Some joined the uprising willingly, their eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and possibility. Others hesitated, torn between the hope of freedom and the terror of retaliation. The movement swelled, contracting and expanding like a living thing. Word traveled in whispers and hurried footsteps, spreading through the quarters in a way that could never have been achieved in daylight. Every sound became a signal: dogs barking in the distance, a door slamming accidentally, the rustle of leaves as someone shifted in the dark. They listened with a sharpened sense of urgency, knowing that the spell of the night could break at any moment. And as they moved onward, leaving behind the shattered stillness of the plantations they had passed through, they carried with them the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. They had crossed the boundary, stepped into a future written not by those who claimed to own them, but by their own hands, their own courage, their own refusal to remain silent in a world that had denied them everything. The moment the revolt began spreading beyond the first plantation, the land itself seemed to shift under the weight of everything unfolding. Darkness still stretched across the countryside, but it no longer felt calm or indifferent. It felt charged, tense, alive with the movement of men who had spent their entire lives confined to someone else's rules, now stepping into a freedom shaped by urgency and necessity. As they moved from one house to another, the reality of what they were doing pressed against their minds with a force that was impossible to ignore. This was no longer just an act of defiance. It was a reckoning, and its echo was starting to reach ears far beyond their starting point. The first hints of panic began quietly, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, sharper and more frantic than usual, a flicker of light from a window in a neighboring farmhouse, a sudden rustling in the brush that made them stop mid-stride and listen carefully, trying to determine whether it was one of their own behind them or someone stumbling upon the aftermath of what they had already done. They were deep in the territory where fear and determination intertwined so tightly that it became impossible to separate them. Every shadow seemed like it might be an armed patrol. Every gust of wind felt like the breath of someone watching from the darkness. But they kept moving, driven by the understanding that stopping was not an option. Not tonight. As they reached the next plantation, the men moved with the same silent coordination they had practiced. But this time, the energy was different. They had already crossed the point of no return, and each step carried the momentum of what they had already set in motion. Those who joined them along the way brought with them not just numbers but stories. Stories of brutality, of families torn apart, of nights spent praying for deliverance that never came. These stories fueled the uprising like dry wood feeding a growing fire. Each new voice made the mission feel larger, heavier, more urgent. The enslaved people who heard what was happening reacted in ways that reflected the complexity of their lives. Some stepped forward without hesitation, eyes bright with a mixture of desperation and long-buried hope. They recognized in this moment the possibility of something they had never dared imagine for themselves. Others trembled at the news, torn between the desire for freedom and the knowledge that the retaliation would be swift and brutal. They understood the cost of rebellion because they had witnessed that cost in other forms every day of their lives. The men leading the revolt never forced anyone to join. Those who chose to remain behind did so with the weight of fear pressing down on them, but those who stepped forward did so with a courage that came from years of unspoken suffering. As the group grew in size, the noise became harder to control. A slip of a boot on a wooden step, the clatter of a tool accidentally hitting the ground, the sharp intake of breath from someone who had never taken part in anything like this before. Every sound risked sending a warning signal into the night, but the urgency of their mission pushed them to move faster, to spread farther, to reach as many plantations as possible before dawn exposed them. They knew that once daylight arrived, the advantage of darkness would disappear entirely,
and with it the precious hours that gave their uprising a chance to spread before resistance could organize. The panic among the slaveholders began slowly and then suddenly erupted. A white boy managed to escape into the woods, running barefoot through the brush until he reached a neighboring farm. Breathless and terrified, he blurted out fragments of what he had seen, words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. For a moment, the adults around him did not understand. They couldn't fathom that the people they had always considered powerless, submissive and broken could organize something so coordinated, so fierce, so determined. But the fear in the boy's eyes was enough to jolt them from disbelief into action. Lanterns lit up across the countryside like scattered stars dropped onto the earth. Horses were pulled from their stables, guns were grabbed with shaking hands, orders were shouted into the darkness. What had started as a whisper of panic quickly grew into a... The uprising had pierced the illusion of control that the slaveholding class had built their lives upon, and now they were scrambling to reclaim it, unsure of how widespread the revolt had become or how many plantations had already fallen. As news of the rebellion spread from farm to farm, the militia began to gather. Men who had spent years enforcing the system of slavery now found themselves confronting a threat they had never imagined possible. They fumbled to organize their forces, trying to read the signs left behind wherever the uprising had passed: broken doorframes, bloodstains on thresholds, scattered belongings that told stories of sudden struggle. They saw the quiet determination in the aftermath, the evidence of a coordinated effort that ran counter to everything they believed about the people they had enslaved. The idea that these men, whom they viewed as inferior, had managed to strike fear into them sparked a rage fueled by both terror and humiliation. Meanwhile, the insurgents pushed forward, but with each step the tension grew. They understood that the window of opportunity was close. The night was no longer a shield, it was becoming a race. The sounds of horses in the distance grew louder.
The shouts of armed men began to echo across the fields.
Torches flickered on neighboring roads, illuminating faces warped by fear and fury. They could see that the landscape around them was shifting rapidly, that the advantage they had held only moments ago was slipping from their grasp. But they pushed onward, fueled by the memory of everything they had endured, and the knowledge that turning back would deliver them to a fate worse than the one they were fighting. As the uprising spread, confusion and chaos rippled through the region. Plantation owners barricaded themselves inside their homes or fled toward nearby towns. Rumors spiraled out of control, each more terrifying than the last. Some claimed the rebellion had hundreds of men marching toward the county seat. Others insisted it had spread across multiple counties. Fear exaggerated every detail, turning uncertainty into terror. The militia responded with violence, striking out at anyone they suspected, often without evidence, driven by the kind of panic that blinds judgment. In the midst of this growing storm, the rebels moved through fields and forests, trying to stay ahead of the tightening noose. They could feel the pursuit behind them and the rising tension ahead of them. Every new plantation they approached carried the possibility of reinforcement or betrayal, hope or disaster. The air buzzed with urgency as they weighed each decision, knowing that every moment counted, every step mattered, every heartbeat could mean the difference between survival and capture. Despite the fear, despite the growing danger, the spirit of the revolt continued to burn. The men who marched knew that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the generations who had lived and died under the weight of change. They knew that even if they did not reach the freedom they sought, their actions would break something powerful in the system that held them. For the first time, the slaveholders were forced to confront the truth that the people they had oppressed were capable of rising, capable of organizing, capable of striking back. And that truth alone shook the foundations of everything the system depended on. The rebellion spread rapidly, carried on the strength of men who had long been trained to endure suffering without complaint, now transformed into fighters driven by purpose and vision. Every movement, every action had been shaped by years of preparation, by the understanding that each small decision could tip the balance between life and death. They moved through the night like shadows, unseen yet felt, their presence marked not by noise but by the sudden absence of the expected. Doors left locked and empty, fields walked over in silence, and houses untouched, except for the signs of disruption, told the story of a force that had emerged from the most unlikely of places. Every step forward carried the weight of generations, and with it the unshakable knowledge that their actions would leave an indelible mark on history. The enslaved men and women who joined the revolt did so with varying degrees of understanding, but all shared a common sense of urgency. Some had witnessed brutality firsthand and were motivated by the sheer desire to survive and retaliate. Others were driven by visions of freedom, distant and uncertain, yet alive in their minds like a promise that could no longer be ignored. Each new participant brought not only their courage but also their knowledge of the terrain, the habits of overseers, and the hidden paths that threaded through fields and forests. This network of knowledge transformed what might have been chaos into a series of calculated moves, a strategy rooted in intimate familiarity with the land and the people who claimed it as their own, even under oppression. As the revolt advanced, the reaction among the slaveholders was swift but disorganized. Panic spread faster than planning and decisions were made in haste, fueled by fear rather than reason. Men who had believed themselves masters found themselves scrambling to protect their families, their property and their sense of control. They organized militias hastily, gathered weapons with trembling hands, and shouted orders that were difficult to follow because no one fully understood the scale or direction of the threat. Their confusion was compounded by rumors, some accurate, some exaggerated, about the number of insurgents, their movements, and the potential alliances forming in neighboring plantations. The uncertainty paralyzed many, and incited fury in others, creating a volatile mix that only strengthened the resolve of those leading the uprising. The insurgents, aware of the approaching threat, adapted constantly, moving quickly, striking decisively and then vanishing into the terrain. Each confrontation was calculated to maximize impact while minimizing exposure, yet even in these moments, the emotional intensity was undeniable. They were fighting for something far larger than themselves, for the collective memory and dignity of countless individuals who had been denied both for generations. The weight of that responsibility pressed upon every participant, sharpening their awareness, heightening their senses, and demanding a focus that allowed them to navigate both the physical danger and the psychological pressure of the rebellion. In the midst of these actions, the leadership displayed by Nat Turner became increasingly evident. He was not only a figurehead but also the strategist, guiding movements, anticipating reactions and interpreting signs in a way that shaped the unfolding events. His visions, once private and intensely personal, now served as a compass for the actions of men. The others followed him not blindly but with a deep understanding that his insight had been tested, shaped by experiences and revelations that gave him an unusual ability to sense timing, opportunity and the intentions of those around him. He was both a spiritual and practical guide, merging the guidance of belief with the demands of reality in a way that few could replicate. The psychological dimension of the rebellion was as significant as the physical confrontations. Fear, both instilled and overcome, played a central role. The insurgents had lived their lives under constant terror, yet in this moment, they transformed that fear into a tool, a source of vigilance, and a reminder of what was at stake. Conversely, the panic among the slaveholders amplified the insurgents' effectiveness, creating opportunities that could be exploited. Every misstep by the militia, every delayed response, every decision made in haste, amplified the sense of power and momentum among the rebels. They learned quickly, adapted quickly, and struck with precision when the opportunity arose, demonstrating not only courage but an extraordinary capacity for strategic thought, under pressure. The geography of the region also played a crucial role. Forested areas provided cover and routes that were invisible to outsiders, while open fields offered opportunities to demonstrate strength and solidarity. The insurgents' intimate knowledge of this landscape gave them an advantage over those who relied solely on conventional assumptions of power and control. They used natural obstacles, shadows and the cover of night to move undetected, striking in bursts that disoriented and intimidated. This mastery of the environment was not accidental. It was the result of years of observation, of learning the habits of overseers, of internalizing the terrain as an extension of themselves, and of seeing the land not just as work but as a living entity that could aid their struggle. As the revolt continued, its impact rippled through communities far beyond the immediate area. News traveled quickly among enslaved populations, bringing hope and inspiration. Even those who were unable to participate directly felt a shift in consciousness, a realization that the long-held assumptions about the inevitability of their subjugation were false. Conversely, the spread of panic among the white population created a climate of heightened tension that would affect social dynamics for months to come. The uprising exposed the fragility of a system that had appeared absolute, revealing vulnerabilities that had been invisible for generations. The violence, while necessary in the context of survival and resistance, was accompanied by a profound awareness of consequences. The insurgents knew that retaliation would be swift and severe, yet the moral weight of their actions was carried consciously. They were not mindless in their attacks. Each action was tempered by an understanding of its necessity and its symbolism. The rebellion was both practical and symbolic, a statement of humanity and agency that challenged the foundations of a society built on oppression. Every confrontation, every strike, every calculated move was a reflection of both desperation and purpose, creating a narrative of resistance that would resonate long after the immediate events concluded. Throughout the uprising, Nat Turner maintained a balance between spiritual guidance and tactical decision-making. His ability to interpret events, to motivate participants, and to anticipate responses from both allies and enemies, was central to the unfolding strategy. He drew upon years of study, reflection and personal revelation to guide actions, blending intuition with careful observation. The trust placed in him by those following was not merely based on charisma, it was reinforced by demonstrable skill and insight, an understanding of both human behavior and the dynamics of power that few outside the enslaved community could have imagined. Even as the rebellion grew in scope and intensity, there was a constant awareness of the fragility of their position. The insurgents knew that every move carried risk, that every decision could result in death or capture. This awareness created a heightened sense of discipline, focus, and unity. Individuals were constantly attuned to the presence of others, to the responses of those they sought to challenge, and to the natural environment around them. The combination of spiritual conviction, strategic planning and intimate knowledge of terrain allowed them to operate with a level of coordination and effectiveness that belied the oppressive circumstances from which they had emerged. The uprising of Nat Turner and his followers demonstrated that power and resistance are not solely determined by numbers or weapons, but also by courage, vision, strategy, and the unyielding belief in one's own humanity. It revealed the potential for oppressed communities to organize, to act decisively, and to challenge systems that had seemed unassailable. Every movement, every act, and every decision reflected years of preparation, understanding, and an acute awareness of the stakes involved. The rebellion was more than a physical confrontation. It was a profound statement of defiance, an embodiment of collective memory, and a living testament to the enduring desire for freedom.
As the uprising progressed, the intensity of the events grew with every passing hour, shaping a narrative of courage, fear, and determination that would resonate long after the immediate consequences. The men who had joined Nat Turner were no longer simply individuals acting out of desperation. They had become part of a movement that carried the weight of history on its shoulders. Every step they took, every action they executed was informed by a combination of long-harbored grievances, strategic insight, and a deep understanding of both the limitations and the possibilities within the environment they navigated. They moved with purpose, aware that what they were doing would be judged not only in the moment but for generations to come. The rebellion was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was the culmination of months of careful observation, spiritual preparation, and quiet organization. Each participant understood that timing, coordination, and discretion were essential. The slightest miscalculation could result in immediate disaster. Yet the fear that lingered in their minds did not weaken their resolve. Instead, it sharpened their focus, forcing them to move with precision and clarity. They became attuned to the rhythms of the plantations, the habits of overseers, the routines of the enslaved people around them, and the patterns that could be exploited to ensure maximum effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary risk. Nat Turner himself carried a dual burden, one spiritual and one practical. His visions, once private and intensely personal, now served as a guiding framework for the actions of the group. He interpreted signs in the environment, the reactions of others, and the unfolding events through the lens of both divine instruction and practical necessity. This combination of prophetic insight and tactical awareness allowed him to lead with an authority that was both respected and unquestioned. Those who followed him did so not merely because of his reputation or charisma, but because his decisions were consistently validated by result. His judgment seemed to anticipate both opportunity and danger with uncanny accuracy. Every encounter during the uprising tested their resolve and ingenuity. The enslaved men and women who had chosen to join understood that each action carried consequences, and yet the moral weight of their struggle provided a clarity of purpose that transcended fear. They were fighting not only for immediate survival but also for the assertion of their humanity, for the right to exist on their own terms, and for the affirmation that generations of oppression could be confronted with courage and intelligence. The knowledge that they were reclaiming something that had been denied to them for so long fueled both their endurance and their willingness to take extraordinary risks. The landscape itself became both an ally and a challenge. Fields, forests, and swamps offered opportunities for concealment, routes for movement, and natural barriers against pursuit. Yet they also presented dangers in the form of uneven terrain, hidden obstacles, and the need to move quickly while maintaining coordination. The rebels' intimate understanding of this terrain provided them with a strategic advantage, allowing them to navigate in ways that those unfamiliar with the land could not anticipate. This geographical knowledge, combined with the disciplined coordination of the group, enabled them to maintain momentum even as the response from the militias grew stronger and more determined. As dawn approached, the intensity of the situation increased. The first hints of light revealed glimpses of the chaos that had been unfolding during the night, smoke rising from chimneys, signs of struggle, and the hurried movements of militia units highlighted both the impact of the uprising and the speed at which resistance was mobilized. The insurgents had to make constant decisions, balancing the need to maintain initiative with the understanding that their window of opportunity was limited. Each choice carried risk, and each action had to be weighed carefully against both immediate safety and the larger strategic goals. The response from the local population was swift and increasingly desperate. White plantation owners, armed with whatever weapons they could muster, moved to secure their families and property. Militias were formed, often in haste and without proper coordination but driven by fear and a sense of urgency that magnified both their aggression and their error. Rumors spread like wildfire, inflating the perceived size and scope of the uprising, creating confusion and panic. This atmosphere of heightened tension and uncertainty worked both for and against the insurgents, as it sometimes opened opportunities for maneuver while also increasing the danger of being discovered or trapped. Despite the growing risks, the insurgents maintained a focus that reflected both discipline and deep commitment to their purpose. Every action was deliberate, from the selection of targets to the timing of movement, to the use of natural cover for concealment and the strategic placement of individuals within the group. This level of coordination required constant vigilance, clear communication, and the ability to adapt quickly to rapidly changing circumstances. They were constantly aware of the need to protect one another, to anticipate threats and to exploit weaknesses in the opposition, and this awareness allowed them to operate effectively under extraordinary pressure. The psychological impact of the rebellion extended beyond the immediate participants. Among the enslaved population, the uprising ignited hope, inspiration, and a renewed sense of possibility. Even those who were not directly involved could see that the oppressive structures that had dominated their lives were not invincible. The knowledge that a group of their own had risen in defiance provided a sense of empowerment and the possibility that the injustices endured daily could be confronted. Conversely, the panic among the white population intensified, highlighting the vulnerability of a system that had relied on the assumption of obedience and submission. The rebellion forced an awareness of fragility, fear, and the consequences of neglecting the humanity of those they sought to control. As the events unfolded, Nat Turner's leadership became increasingly pivotal. His ability to maintain focus, coordinate movements, and provide both spiritual and practical guidance was essential to the cohesion and effectiveness of the group. He communicated through gestures, shared glances, and minimal words, understanding that silence and subtlety were often more powerful than noise. The trust placed in him by the insurgents was reinforced continually by his judgments and decisions, which consistently reflected a combination of strategic acumen and moral authority. He embodied both the vision and the practical execution required to sustain the momentum of the uprising. The uprising also highlighted the resilience, intelligence, and adaptability of the participants. They moved through unfamiliar situations with resourcefulness, reacting to unexpected obstacles with quick thinking and improvisation. Each moment of danger demanded both courage and flexibility, and the ability to make life or death decisions under pressure was continually tested. Their actions demonstrated a deep understanding of human behavior, social dynamics, and the natural environment, allowing them to operate with efficiency and impact, despite the immense risks involved. Every encounter, every maneuver, and every decision reinforced the larger significance of the rebellion. It was not merely a physical confrontation but a profound assertion of agency, identity, and collective will. Each strike, each act of resistance, each calculated movement carried symbolic weight, challenging the legitimacy of a system built on oppression and demonstrating the capacity for those who had been denied power to organize, act decisively, and shape their own destiny. The combination of spiritual conviction, tactical insight, and practical execution made the uprising a unique and powerful event, one that would resonate far beyond the immediate time and place in which it occurred. Nat Turner's rebellion stands as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to accept a life defined by change. His actions shook the foundations of a society built on cruelty, exposing the fragility of a system that relied on fear, obedience, and the erasure of humanity. What made Turner extraordinary was not merely the violence of the revolt, but the courage, vision, and unwavering conviction behind it, a combination of spiritual guidance, strategic insight, and relentless determination that transformed ordinary men into agents of change. He carried within him the memories, grief, and hopes of generations who had been denied freedom, and through his leadership those voices became a force that could no longer be ignored. The uprising demonstrated that true power does not lie in the oppressor's chains or weapons, but in the courage to defy oppression, the clarity to see injustice, and the willingness to act despite overwhelming odds. Turner and his followers reclaimed their humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty, leaving behind a story that continues to inspire, haunt, and challenge society centuries later. It is a story of resistance, of faith, and of the undeniable truth that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit can rise, ignite hope, and demand to be seen. Nat Turner did not merely fight for his own life, he fought for the right to exist, to remember, and to defy. His legacy reminds us that freedom is not granted, it is seized, defended, and carried forward by those brave enough to risk everything. The echoes of his rebellion continue to remind the world that the fight against injustice is eternal,
that courage can inspire countless others, and that the memory of the oppressed can never be silent. In the story of Nat Turner, the fire of defiance burns still, illuminating a path that no chains, no fear, and no oppression can ever extinguish.